Fragmentation, Andrea, I mean, as it's very topical given the EU leaders meeting today. Last week you were warning how we could get further fragmentation under the UK settlement with rules for ins and outs of the Eurozone, but that's for later on the panel maybe. But, what's your view on this fragmentation? Is it possible to get a more seamless approach globally, or with your US colleagues, or in Asia, or within Europe? I mean, what's causing the fragmentation? Is it simply disagreements among the regulators, or is it sort of not being able to drill down to the ground level?
Well, first of all, let me try to dispel a little bit of the gloomy picture that has been emerging so far in terms of regulatory-driven fragmentation. I mean, what we have in Europe, for instance, is a massive step forward towards greater harmonization of rules. I mean, for the first time, we have the single rule book. A lot of rules have been implemented via regulations. The core of the reform packages, of the G20 reform package, has been implemented through regulations legally binding to all the member states. We have issued more than 150 standards which are applicable to all the banks in the Union in the same way. We have single definition of asset quality, single definition of capital, single reporting, so massive progress in terms of harmonization in my view. Also at the global level, if you look at the core prudential requirements and what the Basel Committee has done, I mean, we have rules which are much more detailed and precise at the global level. The Basel Committee can do reviews of individual jurisdictions by assessing the deviation in basis points of the rules calculated under the Basel standards and under the domestic, let's say, jurisdictional implementation.
Which Europe didn't do too well in the last.
I know, but again, that's a positive step in my view in terms of checking implementation of the standards. Could we do more at the European level? At the global level in terms of having more common rules? Well, I think an opportunity has been missed after the crisis. I would have liked personally to have more legal underpinning globally for the global standards. For instance, I'm still struggling to understand why financial rules cannot be part of international treaties. For instance, they're always expelled from international treaties. I think it would be a good idea to have them there. But even without moving to international treaties, I'm always, using the example of the IFRS. No? The IFRS, in my view, is an interesting example. You have an international body which sets standards, accounting standards for 200 jurisdictions, approximately, across the world. And in Europe, for instance, we have this revolving door by means of which you have a commitment to implement the standards as they are into European regulations, which are immediately binding to all the member states. So there could be steps that can be done to give stronger underpinnings to the standards. But that's on the, let's say, on the defensive side. A lot done in harmonization, we could do more globally. But, let's say, I think that there is indeed a fragmentation which is driven also by regulators and by supervisors in particular. And I think that besides the core prudential standards, the key issues are how these standards are applied in practice by supervisors, so all the discretion that supervisors have in implementation, like in Pillar 2, for instance. We have seen a lot of ring fencing going on during the crisis for understandable reasons, but a lot of ring fencing, which has broken also the single market internally, and has trapped capital and liquidity in individual jurisdictions. And this was not due to regulatory, let's say, to the rules, was due to the actions taken by the authorities under these rules. And the second aspect is a number of additional layers of rules, like the macroprudential rules, for instance, or the tax or the levies which have been charged, which all reflect the massive impact that the crisis has had on national budgets. And of course, national authorities, I mean, the immediate reaction has been, I want to make sure that if something happens, I do have resources here that can protect my taxpayers, my depositors. Now, looking forward, how do you overcome this knee-jerk reaction to the crisis? I think the best way to do that is by acting on recovery and resolution planning. I mean, recovery and resolution plans can have two possible outcomes. One is that they crystallize a segmentation into national buckets, so everybody gets, let's say, the domestic resolution of the domestic...
Exactly what happens when things go wrong. Yeah.
Exactly. Or you can have that recovery and resolution plans are used to reestablish trust between authorities that if things go wrong, you will act in a cooperative fashion to deal with the problem. And if the second is the outcome, I think that we can restore a lot of the, let's say, cross-border coordination that we need for greater market integration.
Okay, so a lot to think about that, I think, especially your interesting idea on the missed opportunity of not making these global rules more legally binding. We did hear from, I think, David Wright of IOSCO. We should have maybe a global treaty, and I think it went down like a lead balloon in the United States anyway. So you still have problems of sovereignty and people... not willing to give up that final right to determine what they want to do with their own banks. So where do we go from here? To what other ideas do we have to impose more harmonization, to get rid of these national discretions? I think most of them are in the Eurozone anyway, in Europe. What can we do to, in a way, get back the trust between the regulators, in a way, to allow banks to become more cross-border? Of course,
But the whole question is that's what we have been trying to do in the last 8 years since the crisis. And, Andrea made the case in point. I mean, we have at the time even tried from the IIF to push harmonization via a multilateral treaty on recovery and resolution. It was not doable. We even had a framework treaty once published, if I remember correctly, as to how it could look like, to stipulate the basic principles of mutual acceptance and enforcement of cross-border recovery and resolution actions. That's, unless you have that, there will always be the tendency of every regulator in the world to put the buffer around the area where he sits and he's responsible for.
Their taxpayers, obviously.
Yeah, and that is not something which, as a human being, I don't understand. As a banker, I may not like it, but it is something which, unless you have clear rules that you are convinced would also work in an extreme case, there is a tendency that everybody will say, well, I want to at least be sure I have enough buffer in order to make sure that at least my systemically relevant functions or my bank in my territory be saved. And the net result of that is you add up complexity. Now, what can you do as a bank? You can say, well, if it gets too complex or if the costs become so big that you can say, well, I cannot earn a decent return anymore going forward, then you may have to decomplex your organization, your structure, and maybe you then take hard decisions on what you do where and to what extent. And that's what we are doing.
Maybe I turn to Pierre. Andrea was saying there that recovery and resolution plans will help investors more confidence maybe to let cross-border banks operate more freely. You're on the board of Belgium's resolution competent authority. Do you agree with that? Do you think that? Would you trust if a bank has a proper resolution plan that they can go and play cross-border?
First, to make a more general point and get to your point very specifically, we're talking about fragmentation, and there has been fragmentation in the past in the setting of the rules. Basel rules in the US has not been Basel rules in Europe. The way they were in Europe transposed in different countries, yes, there were distinctions, as Sylvie was pointing out. But my experience is that the biggest discrepancies that have developed have been at supervisory level. It was not the rules themselves, it was the way they were implemented by different banks and the way the supervisors allowed or did not allow certain things to be done. And there we should not underestimate the huge improvement that takes place with the single supervisor. Now, having the European Central Bank be the supervisor of all of the key banks in Europe does not come for free. There will be issues about the dual role of monetary policy and financial stability goals. But still, it's a huge development. And to get to your question, the same is probably true with respect to the Single Resolution Board. And most of the powers are with the SRB, are the Single Resolution Board, and the national authorities will be feeding information to them and advice to them. And there I entirely agree with Andrea. There is an opportunity to make sure that the recovery plans and the resolution plans that would come behind that are coherent around Europe. And that will avoid a risk of supervisory arbitrage, which is the complement to regulatory arbitrage.